What happens when the law itself becomes lawless? When the very men sworn to protect and serve choose to torment and humiliate? In the quiet, all-American town of Harmony Creek, two police officers, fueled by arrogance and prejudice, decided to have a little fun one night. Their victim was a lone black man they found walking on the wrong side of the tracks. They tied him to a telephone pole, mocked him, and left him in the dark. They had no idea that the man they chose to degrade, Mr. Marcus Thorne, was not just another face in the crowd. He was their new chief of police, and he was about to bring a reckoning that would shatter their world and expose the town's darkest secrets. The air in Harmony Creek, Oregon, had a sweet, deceptive quality on late summer nights. It smelled of pine needles from the surrounding forests and freshly cut grass from the meticulously kept lawns of the town's affluent north side. It was a scent of peace, of order, of a life undisturbed. It was this very scent that Marcus Thorne was trying to commit to memory as he walked along the dimly lit sidewalk of Sycamore Lane. At 46, Marcus was a man carved from discipline and adversity, a 20-year veteran of the Baltimore Police Department who had risen from a beat cop in the city's toughest neighborhoods to a highly respected deputy commissioner. He had seen the worst of humanity, but he had also seen the best. He believed in the fundamental idea of policing, the ideal of the guardian, even if he had watched it get corrupted time and again. That's why he'd accepted the job in Harmony Creek. It was supposed to be a change, a chance to build a department from a place of community trust, not from the rubble of riots and recriminations. He had arrived in town 3 days before his official start date, a move that was characteristically his. He didn't check into a fancy hotel. He rented a small, unassuming apartment on the south side of town, the side the tourist brochures didn't feature. He wanted to feel the town's pulse without the filter of a uniform and a title. He wanted to walk its streets, eat in its diners, and listen to its whispers before they knew to whisper around him. Tonight, he wore a simple gray hoodie, faded jeans, and a pair of worn-out running shoes. His rental car, a nondescript sedan, had gotten a flat tire a mile back. Instead of calling for a tow, he decided to walk. He needed to think. The weight of his new position, the hope of the city council, and the unspoken skepticism of the 150 officers he was about to command, all rested heavily on his broad shoulders. He looked up at the stately colonial homes, their windows warm with yellow light, and wondered if this place could truly be the sanctuary it appeared to be. That's when the headlights painted him in a blinding white glare. A police cruiser, a Ford Interceptor, slowed to a crawl beside him. It didn't use its siren, just the unnerving quiet of its electric engine and the piercing intensity of its spotlight. Marcus stopped walking and stood still, keeping his hands visible out of a lifetime of ingrained habit. He wasn't a cop in this moment. He was just a black man in a hoodie in a wealthy neighborhood after dark. He knew the script. The passenger side window hummed down. Inside sat two officers. The man in the passenger seat, who was leaning over with a smirk, had a thick neck and a face that seemed permanently flushed. His name tag read Sullivan. The driver, younger, with a nervous energy about him, was Miller. "Evening," Sully said, his voice dripping with a cloying, false friendliness. "Bit of a late-night stroll, aren't we? You lost?" "Just enjoying the air," Marcus replied, his voice calm and even. He met the officer's gaze without aggression, but also without submission. "My car got a flat a ways back. I was heading toward the gas station on Route 2. Sully, whose full name was Officer Dale Sullivan, had been on the Harmony Creek force for 12 years. He was a legacy, his father having been a revered sergeant. Dale, however, lacked his father's integrity, replacing it with a swaggering arrogance. He saw himself not as a public servant, but as a gatekeeper of the town's pristine image, and Marcus, in his view, didn't fit the picture. "Route 2? That's a good 2 miles from here," Sully said, his eyes scanning Marcus from head to toe, lingering on the worn quality of his clothes. "You don't look like you're from around here. We don't get many visitors on this side of town, especially on foot." The word visitors was laced with insinuation. "I'm new in town," Marcus said simply, offering no more. He didn't want to play this game, but he also knew that escalating it was a fool's errand. "New in town," Sully repeated, drawing the words out. He turned to his partner, Miller. "Hear that, Kev?" He's new. We should show him some Harmony Creek hospitality. Officer Kevin Miller shifted uncomfortably. He was only 3 years on the job and still lived in the shadow of senior officers like Sully. He often felt a knot in his stomach when Sully went into this mode, but he feared the man's ridicule more than he trusted his own conscience. Sully, maybe we just give him a ride, Miller suggested weakly. Sully ignored him. He pushed his door open, the interior light briefly illuminating the smug satisfaction on his face. Tell you what, let's see some ID, just to make sure you are who you say you are. Marcus sighed internally. It's in my car. Like I said, it's about a mile back. That's inconvenient, Sully clucked, stepping onto the sidewalk. He was shorter than Marcus, but carried himself with the puffed-up confidence of a man who held all the power. You see, we've had a string of break-ins in this neighborhood. People casing houses, looking for opportunities, and you, my friend, fit the description. It was a lie, and they both knew it. There had been no string of break-ins. There was only a black man walking where Sully believed he shouldn't be. I can assure you, officer, I'm not casing any houses, Marcus said, his voice hardening slightly. The Baltimore detective in him was analyzing, cataloging, Sully's dilated pupils, the slight tremor of excitement in his hands. This wasn't about procedure. This was a power trip. This was sport. That's for us to decide, Sully said, his smirk widening into a predatory grin. You know, we have a special way of dealing with suspicious characters here in Harmony Creek. A little welcoming committee, you could say. He unclipped a pair of heavy-duty zip ties from his belt. Turn around. Put your hands behind your back. Marcus stood his ground. You have no probable cause to detain me. Sully laughed, a short, ugly bark. Probable cause? Son, my presence here is the only cause I need. Now turn around before this gets unpleasant. He gestured with his head to Miller, who reluctantly got out of the car, his hand hovering nervously over his sidearm. Marcus weighed his options in a split second. He could reveal who he was right now, watch the color drain from their faces, and deal with the fallout. But that would be too easy. It would be a problem solved for him, personally. It would do nothing to address the deeper sickness that this encounter revealed. No, he needed to see this through. He needed to know exactly what kind of department he was inheriting. He needed to feel the rot from the inside. Slowly, deliberately, he turned and placed his hands behind his back. The decision felt like stepping off a cliff in the dark, trusting he would eventually find the ground. The plastic of the zip ties bit into his wrists as Sully cinched them with a grunt of satisfaction. There now, that's better. He shoved Marcus toward a thick wooden telephone pole on the edge of the sidewalk. Kevin, give me a hand here. Let's make our new friend feel nice and secure. A pillar of the community. Miller hesitated, his face a mask of conflict. Sully, this ain't right. What if someone sees? Who's gonna see? It's midnight in Pleasantville, Sully scoffed. And who are they gonna believe? Us or him? Stop being such a rookie and help me out. With a defeated look, Miller held Marcus against the pole, while Sully used several more zip ties to strap his torso to the splintered wood. They bound him tightly, his chest pressed against the creosote-smelling pole, his arms wrenched behind him. Once he was secured, Sully stepped back to admire his work. He pulled out his personal cell phone. The screen's glow cast a ghoulish light on his face. Gotta commemorate the occasion. The boys at the precinct will love this. Click. The shutter sound was sharp in the quiet night. Click. Click. He took several more from different angles. Smile for the camera, Sully taunted, his voice low and venomous. Welcome to Harmony Creek. Hope you enjoy your stay. We'll be back to check on you. Eventually. He and Miller got back in the cruiser. As the car pulled away, Marcus could see Miller staring back at him in the side mirror, his expression unreadable, before the red taillights disappeared around the corner. And then there was only silence. The sweet smell of pine and cut grass was gone, replaced by the acrid stench of creosote and injustice. Marcus Thorne, the new chief of the Harmony Creek Police Department, was tied to a pole, a prisoner in the very town he had come to protect. The storm had arrived, and he was in its eye. The cold from the pole began to seep through his hoodie, a deep, damp chill that settled in his bones. For the first few minutes, Marcus Thorne's world was a storm of pure, unadulterated fury. Every instinct honed over 2 decades of law enforcement screamed at him to fight, to break free, to hunt down those two officers and strip them of the authority they had so grotesquely abused. His wrist burned where the zip ties cut into his skin. His shoulder muscles, torqued at an unnatural angle, began to ache with a low, insistent throb. But then the training kicked in, the discipline, the part of his brain that had kept him alive in Baltimore back alleys and during tense standoffs took over. Rage was a wildfire. It consumed everything and left nothing but ash. What he needed now was the cold, hard precision of steel. He closed his eyes and focused on his breathing, slowing his heart rate, pushing the red haze of anger away. He became an observer of his own predicament. He cataloged every detail. The time, approximately 12:15 a.m., based on the last time he checked his watch. The location, Sycamore Lane, about 200 yards east of the intersection with Oak Street. The pole itself, utility pole number HC774B, the metal plate digging into his cheek. The officers, Sullivan, Dale, the ringleader, mid-30s, arrogant, likely a bully with a history of complaints if anyone had ever dared to file them. And Miller, Kevin, younger, a follower, conflicted but ultimately complicit. The evidence? The photos on Sullivan's personal phone. A critical mistake on the officer's part. He tested the restraints. The zip ties were commercial grade, thick and unyielding. There was no breaking them through brute force. He methodically worked his wrists back and forth, not trying to snap the plastic, but to create the tiniest bit of slack, to keep the blood flowing. He was not a victim. He was an investigator, and this was his crime scene. Minutes stretched into an eternity. A car passed, its occupants oblivious, their laughter spilling out of an open window into the night. A dog barked in a distant yard. The automatic sprinklers of a nearby mansion hissed to life, casting a fine mist that dampened his jeans. Each sound, each sensation, was a reminder of his powerlessness, his humiliation. He thought about his predecessor, Chief Reynolds, a man who had retired under a cloud of vague accusations about old-school policing and a disconnect from the community. The city council had hired Marcus specifically to be a reformer, a bridge builder. They had spoken of transparency and accountability. Had they known this poison was festering right under their noses? Or had they simply chosen not to look? He thought about his late wife, Sarah, who had been a civil rights attorney. She would have been incandescent with rage, but she also would have been the first to tell him to use this. Don't just get angry, Marcus. He could almost hear her voice. Get smart. Use their bigotry as a weapon against them. Let them build their own gallows. The thought of her centered him. This was no longer just a personal affront. It was a mission. This incident was a symptom of a disease, and he had been given the rare opportunity to diagnose it from the inside. Any other man, any ordinary citizen, would have had his word against two officers of the law. His complaint would have been buried in paperwork, dismissed as the ravings of a disgruntled transient. But Marcus Thorne was not any other man. He had the power, or would soon, to turn this town's justice system inside out. An hour crawled by. The ache in his shoulders had graduated to a searing pain. His legs were numb. Just as a sliver of despair began to creep into the edges of his resolve, he heard the crunch of tires on gravel. Not a police cruiser. An older vehicle, a pickup truck by the sound of its sputtering engine. It pulled over about 50 feet away. The engine cut out and a door creaked open. An old man, probably in his late 70s, with a stooped back and a shuffling gait, got out. He was holding a small dog on a leash. The man's name was Arthur Pembroke, a retired history teacher who had lived on Sycamore Lane for 50 years and suffered from insomnia. Arthur stopped dead when he saw the figure tied to the pole. His little beagle, Winston, let out a confused yip. "Good Lord," Arthur whispered, his voice shaky. He fumbled in his pocket for his glasses. Are you all right, son?" "I've been better," Marcus said, his voice raspy. "Could you help me?" Arthur shuffled closer, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and concern. "What happened? Who did this to you?" "Two police officers," Marcus stated, the words tasting like acid. The old man's face fell. He looked around the empty street as if expecting the culprits to reappear. Arthur had lived in Harmony Creek long enough to hear stories, to know that the town's placid surface hid murky depths. He'd heard whispers about officers like Dale Sullivan. That Dale, he's his father's son in all the wrong ways, Arthur muttered to himself. He then looked at Marcus with determination. Don't you worry, I'll get you out of this. He hobbled back to his truck and returned with a pair of rusty but sturdy wire cutters from his toolbox. Been meaning to trim the hedges, he explained as he positioned the cutters around the first zip tie on Marcus's chest. The plastic was thick. Arthur grunted with effort, his old hands trembling. With a loud snap, the first tie broke free. He worked his way through the others, each snap a small victory against the night's indignity. Finally, he cut the ties on Marcus's wrists. Freedom was agonizing. Blood rushed back into Marcus's hands with a pins and needles intensity that made him gasp. He stumbled, leaning against the pole for support, rubbing his wrist to restore circulation. Thank you, Marcus said, his voice filled with a gratitude so profound it surprised him. You don't know what you've done. Just doing what's right, Arthur said gruffly, though his eyes were kind. The police station is just downtown. We can go there right now and report this. I'll be your witness. Marcus shook his head. A small, cold smile touched his lips. It was the first time he had smiled all night. No, not the police station. Not yet. He looked at the old man. I need to ask a favor. I need you to not say a word about this to anyone. Not for a few days. Can you do that for me? Arthur was confused, but he saw the iron resolve in Marcus's eyes. It was the look of a man who was not running from a fight, but preparing for one. All right, son, I don't understand it, but I'll keep my mouth shut. My name is Arthur Pembroke, if you need me. I will, Marcus promised. Thank you, Arthur. He limped back to his car, the physical pain a dull echo of the moral injury he had sustained. He changed the tire under the pale glow of a single streetlight, his movements stiff but precise. He didn't go back to his apartment. Instead, he drove to a 24-hour diner on the outskirts of town. Over a cup of black coffee that did little to warm him, he pulled out his phone. He didn't call the mayor or the city manager. He called a number he hadn't used in years. It belonged to an old friend from his early days in Baltimore, a man named David Chen, who was now a top prosecutor in the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. David, he said when the sleepy voice answered, it's Marcus Thorne. Sorry to call so late. Listen, I think I've stumbled into something big in a small town in Oregon. I'm going to need your advice on how to build a federal case. Because what happened to me tonight wasn't just a policy violation, it was a crime. For the next hour, he laid out the entire story, meticulously detailing every action, every word. He wasn't just a victim anymore. He was Chief Marcus Thorne, and he was methodically laying the foundation for the justice that was to come. The long night was over. The dawn and the reckoning it would bring was just hours away. The next morning, the Harmony Creek Police Department precinct was buzzing with an anxious, caffeinated energy. It was 8 a.m., the official start of the new era. Officers milled around the briefing room, straightening their ties, their faces a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. The retirement of the old chief had been abrupt, and the hiring of an outsider from a big city like Baltimore had sent ripples of unease through the ranks. Officer Dale Sullivan leaned back in his chair, a styrofoam cup of coffee in his hand, holding court with a small group of younger officers. He was in his element, the alpha male of the shift. I'm telling you, this new guy, Thorne, he's gonna be a suit, Sully said, a dismissive sneer on his face. Some Baltimore desk jockey. He's gonna come in here talking about community outreach and de-escalation. All that soft-touch nonsense. He'll last 6 months before he runs back to the big city with his tail between his legs. He took a theatrical sip of his coffee. Speaking of which, me and Miller had to do some community outreach of our own last night. Right, Kev? He winked at his partner, who was standing nervously by the door. Kevin Miller's face was pale. He hadn't slept a wink. The image of the man strapped to the pole had been burned into his mind. He'd driven past the spot at the end of his shift around 3 a.m., his heart pounding, and had been terrified to see the pole was empty. He didn't know if the man had gotten free, if someone had found him, or if Sully had gone back. All he knew was that the knot in his stomach had twisted into a solid ball of dread. "Yeah, Sully." "Right," Miller mumbled, avoiding eye contact. Sully laughed, enjoying Miller's discomfort. He pulled out his phone. "Check out the new addition to the neighborhood watch," he said, showing the picture to the officers gathered around him. The photo on the screen was clear. A black man in a gray hoodie, his face a mask of stoicism, bound to the utility pole. The flash from the camera had illuminated the scene in stark, damning detail. A few of the younger cops chuckled nervously. An older veteran just shook his head and walked away. "You tied him to a pole?" one of them asked, half in awe, half in disbelief. "Just giving him a place to hang out for a while," Sully bragged. "Sent a clear message. We don't play around in Harmony Creek." At the front of the room stood Sergeant Frank Rizzo, a 30-year veteran with a weary face and a gut that strained the buttons of his uniform shirt. He was 5 months from retirement, and his only goal was to cross the finish line without any trouble. He'd heard Sully boasting and had seen the photo. A flicker of alarm went through him, but he quashed it. It was just Sully being Sully. Messy, but it would blow over. Intervening would mean paperwork and confrontation and a headache he didn't need. He chose, as he often did, the path of least resistance. He chose silence. "All right, settle down," Rizzo called out, his voice gravelly. "The city manager and the new chief will be here any minute. Look sharp." The room quieted. A moment later, the door opened, and City Manager Thompson, a perpetually flustered man in an ill-fitting suit, walked in. "Good morning, everyone," he said, beaming. "This is a momentous day for Harmony Creek. It is my great honor to introduce a man with a sterling record, a commitment to modern, effective policing, and a vision for our future. Ladies and gentlemen, your new chief of police, Marcus Thorne." He stepped aside, gesturing to the door. And in walked Marcus Thorne. He was no longer the man in the hoodie. He was immaculate in a crisp, dark blue dress uniform, the 4 stars of a police chief gleaming on each collar point. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine. He stood tall, his posture ramrod straight, and his eyes, cold and clear as ice, swept across the room. The effect was like a switch being thrown, sucking all the air and sound out of the briefing room. Jaws literally dropped. Officers who had been slouching snapped to attention, but for 3 men, the reaction was far more visceral. Sergeant Rizzo's face went slack, his jaded eyes widening in dawning horror as his brain connected the face in the uniform with the whispers of Sully's late-night prank. Kevin Miller felt the blood drain from his face. The world tilted on its axis. He thought he was going to be sick. The man from the pole? The man from the photo? He was here. He was their boss. And Dale Sullivan. Sully's smug grin froze, then melted away into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. The styrofoam cup slipped from his nerveless fingers, splashing hot coffee onto the floor. His phone, still in his other hand, suddenly felt like a live grenade. He was staring at a ghost, the ghost he had mocked, assaulted, and photographed just 8 hours earlier. Marcus Thorne walked to the podium at the front of the room. He didn't smile. He didn't offer pleasantries. He let the crushing silence hang in the air for a full 10 seconds, his gaze drifting over the sea of stunned faces until it landed, with deliberate, chilling precision, on Dale Sullivan. He held the officer's terrified gaze for a moment before he began to speak. His voice was not loud, but it filled the room with an absolute authority that no one dared to question. "Good morning," he said, the words sharp and clipped. "My name is Marcus Thorne. I am your new chief of police. I had intended for my first address to you to be about my vision for this department, about building trust, about integrity, about our shared commitment to the safety of this community." He paused, letting the words sink in. "However, events of the last 12 hours have forced a change of plans." His eyes now moved from Sullivan to Miller, who looked like he was about to faint, and then to Sergeant Rizzo, whose face was ashen. "Last night, I was introduced to a certain brand of Harmony Creek hospitality," Marcus continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was somehow more menacing than a shout. "I learned that some officers in this department believe that their badge is a license to harass, to humiliate, and to assault a citizen based on the color of his skin and the clothes he wears. They believe it is acceptable to use department resources to illegally detain an individual, to tie him to a public utility pole, and to photograph the act for their own amusement. A collective gasp went through the room. Officers looked at each other, then at Sully and Miller, the truth crashing down on them in a wave of disbelief and dread. So my first act as chief will not be a speech. It will be an action. He looked directly at Sully and Miller. Officer Sullivan, Officer Miller, you are hereby suspended, effective immediately. Place your badge, your weapon, and your department ID on the table in front of you. You will be escorted from this building. You are not to speak to any other member of this department until you are contacted by Internal Affairs. Sully, jolted out of his stupor by a surge of defiant adrenaline, started to speak. Chief, it was a misunderstanding. A joke. You think this is a joke? Marcus's voice was like the crack of a whip. You think depriving a citizen of his civil rights is a joke? You think assault under color of law is a joke? He pointed a finger at the officer. You have the right to remain silent, Officer Sullivan. I strongly suggest you start exercising it. He then turned his cold gaze to Sergeant Rizzo. Sergeant Rizzo, as the ranking officer on duty last night and the supervisor in this room this morning who heard Officer Sullivan bragging about his criminal conduct and did nothing, you are also suspended. Your dereliction of duty makes you complicit. Place your weapon and badge on the table. Rizzo looked like he'd been punched in the gut. His retirement, his pension, his entire legacy was evaporating before his eyes. Marcus Thorne surveyed the room of shell-shocked officers. Let me be perfectly clear to everyone in this room. The culture that allowed for this to happen ends today. Right now, there will be a full top-to-bottom investigation. We will be transparent, we will be thorough, and we will be ruthless in rooting out the poison in this department. If you have a problem with that, the door's right there. This is day one. The work begins now. Dismissed. No one moved. They were frozen, caught between the sheer audacity of what had happened and the terrifying absolute authority of the man standing before them. The new chief hadn't just taken command. He had detonated a bomb in the very heart of the Harmony Creek Police Department. The suspension of 3 officers, including a popular legacy cop and a senior sergeant, on the new chief's very first day, sent shockwaves through the Harmony Creek Police Department. But Chief Thorne was just getting started. He knew that an internal investigation, handled by the existing structure, would be compromised. The blue wall of silence was a real and powerful force, and the friendships and loyalties within the department ran deep. So on the afternoon of that first day, he made a call to the state capitol. By the next morning, a team of 2 seasoned investigators from the State Police Professional Standards Unit had arrived. They were outsiders, beholden to no one in Harmony Creek. Their names were Detective Maria Sanchez, a sharp, no-nonsense interrogator, and Detective Ben Carter, a meticulous expert in digital forensics. Thorne handed them the case with a single clear directive. Follow the facts wherever they lead. No one is protected. Their first stop was Dale Sullivan's locker. As expected, it was clean. But his department-issued phone was another story. Even though Sully had frantically deleted the photos from his gallery, Detective Carter knew that deleted rarely means gone. Within hours, he had recovered the 3 crystal-clear images of Marcus Thorne tied to the pole. It was the smoking gun. Meanwhile, the story was starting to leak. A disgruntled dispatcher, loyal to Sully, made an anonymous call to the local newspaper, the Harmony Creek Chronicle. The tip landed on the desk of Sarah Jenkins, a young, ambitious reporter who was tired of writing about town fairs and zoning board meetings. Her editor was skeptical, but the sheer drama of the rumor, new chief suspends 3 cops on day 1, was too juicy to ignore. Sarah started digging. She camped out near the precinct, talking to officers coming off shift. Most gave her a cold shoulder, but she found a few of the younger ones, the ones who had been made uncomfortable by Sully's antics for years, willing to talk off the record. They wouldn't confirm the story about the pole, but they painted a picture of Dale Sullivan as a bully who operated with impunity, protected by his father's name, and the indifference of senior command like Sergeant Rizzo. Her big break came from an unexpected source. Arthur Pembroke, the retired teacher who had freed Marcus, read the initial, vague report in the Chronicle about the suspensions. His conscience, combined with a deep-seated respect for the truth, compelled him to act. He called the newspaper and asked to speak to Sarah Jenkins. They met at a small cafe. Arthur, his hands trembling slightly as he held his coffee cup, recounted the entire story of finding Marcus, the state he was in, and the chilling words, "2 police officers did this to me." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. This was it. This was the story. She had a named, credible witness. "Mr. Pembroke, would you be willing to go on the record with this?" she asked. Arthur took a deep breath. "A man has a duty to stand up for what's right," he said. "Yes, I will." The next day, the story exploded. The front page of the Harmony Creek Chronicle featured the headline, "New Chief Was Victim. Report alleges officers tied top cop to pole." The article laid out the entire narrative, quoting Arthur Pembroke extensively. The story was immediately picked up by state news, then national outlets. Harmony Creek, the idyllic small town, was suddenly at the center of a media firestorm. Reporters from Portland and even national news networks began descending on the town. The community was ripped in two. A vocal contingent, rallied by Dale Sullivan's family and friends, started a Support Our Cops Facebook group. They claimed it was all a misunderstanding, a prank gone wrong, and that the new outsider chief was on a politically motivated witch hunt. They held small but loud rallies outside the police station, their signs accusing Thorne of being anti-police. But a larger, quieter portion of the community was horrified. People of color, who had long shared stories of harassment that were dismissed or ignored, felt a grim sense of vindication. Progressive white residents, who had prided themselves on living in a forward-thinking town, were forced to confront the ugliness beneath the surface. The city council held an emergency meeting, publicly backing Chief Thorne, but privately panicking at the national embarrassment. For the 3 suspended officers, the pressure was immense. Sergeant Frank Rizzo hired a lawyer and immediately filed for his retirement, hoping to escape the mess and secure his pension. But Chief Thorne had anticipated this. He sent a formal notice to the state pension board, flagging Rizzo's account pending the outcome of the investigation, effectively freezing his exit strategy. Rizzo was trapped. His quiet, comfortable retirement had vanished, replaced by a nightmare of legal fees and public shame. He stopped answering his phone and became a recluse in his own home. Dale Sullivan, true to form, came out swinging. Backed by a bullish police union lawyer, he went on a local news station. With his wife and 2 children standing beside him for sympathy, he painted himself as the victim. "It was a simple misunderstanding," he said, his face a mask of feigned sincerity. "We thought he was a prowler. The situation was tense. We secured him until we could verify his identity. This new chief has a political agenda, and he's trying to make an example out of a dedicated 12-year veteran." He didn't mention the zip ties, the mockery, or the photos. It was a performance, but one that resonated with his supporters. The real drama, however, was happening inside the quiet suburban home of Kevin Miller. He was crumbling. The media scrutiny was terrifying. His face, though not named in the initial reports, was plastered everywhere alongside Sully's in photos of the rallies. His wife, Jessica, was distraught. "What were you thinking, Kevin?" she cried one night, holding the newspaper with his partner's face on it. "A prank? You helped him tie a man to a pole? You stood by while he took pictures?" "I didn't know what to do," Kevin confessed, his voice breaking. "Sully, you know how he is. If I'd said no, he would have made my life a living hell at work. I froze." "Work?" Jessica shot back, her voice rising. "You're going to lose your job anyway. You could go to prison. And for what? So Dale Sullivan wouldn't make fun of you? We have a mortgage, Kevin. We have a baby on the way. You need to think about your family. You need to do the right thing." Her words hit him harder than any interrogator's questions could. He looked at his pregnant wife, at the life they were supposed to be building, and he saw it all slipping away. He was tethered to a sinking ship named Dale Sullivan. A few days later, a formal, hand-delivered letter arrived at his house. It was from Detective Sanchez. It was a request for a formal interview, not at the precinct, but at a neutral location, a conference room at the county courthouse. The letter also contained a single chilling sentence. "We have recovered the photographs from Officer Sullivan's mobile device." Kevin Miller read that sentence, and the last of his resolve to protect his partner evaporated. They had the photos. They had the witness. Sully's story about a tense situation was a lie that was about to be exposed in court. He was staring down the barrel of a federal civil rights charge. He looked at his wife, her eyes full of fear and hope. He knew he had a choice to make. He could go down with Sully, clinging to the shattered illusion of the blue wall, or he could try to save himself and his family by doing the one thing he had been too scared to do that night on Sycamore Lane: tell the truth. Trembling, he picked up his phone and called the number for Detective Sanchez. "This is Kevin Miller," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm ready to talk, and I'll tell you everything." The meeting was set for a sterile conference room in the basement of the county administration building, a place chosen for its lack of prying eyes and its intimidating official atmosphere. Kevin Miller sat at one side of a long, polished table. Across from him sat Detective Maria Sanchez and, to his surprise, Chief Marcus Thorne. Thorne was not in uniform. He wore a simple charcoal suit, but his presence was no less commanding. He hadn't said a word since Miller had entered the room, simply observing him with those same intense, unreadable eyes from the briefing room. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Miller," Detective Sanchez began, her voice professional but not unkind. "You're here voluntarily, and you are free to leave at any time. You can also have an attorney present if you wish." Kevin shook his head, his hands clammy. "No, no lawyer. I need to tell you what happened." For the next hour, the story poured out of him. He recounted every detail of that night, from Sully's first smug comment to the sound of the camera shutter. He didn't spare himself. He admitted to his own cowardice, his fear of Sully, and his failure to intervene. He talked about the culture within the department, the way Sully and a few others would refer to the residents of the South Side with derogatory slang, the way they'd brag about tossing cars for no reason. He described Sergeant Rizzo's willful blindness, a supervisor who saw everything and chose to address nothing. He called it a welcoming committee, Kevin said, his voice cracking. He was enjoying it. It was like a game to him. And I just stood there. I held him. I held the chief, while Sully strapped him to the pole. I didn't stop him. Tears welled in his eyes, a mixture of shame and terror. When he finished, the room was silent. Sanchez closed her notebook. Chief Thorne finally leaned forward, placing his hands on the table. "Officer Miller," Thorne began, his voice low and steady, "why are you telling us this now?" "Because it was wrong," Kevin whispered, looking down at his hands. "I knew it was wrong then, and I know it now. My wife. We're expecting our first child. I can't bring a kid into this world with this hanging over me. I can't be that person anymore." He finally looked up directly at Thorne. "What you said in that briefing room about rooting out the poison, maybe I'm part of that poison, but I don't want to be. I am so sorry, Chief, for what I did and for what I didn't do." Thorne held his gaze for a long moment, his expression unreadable. He was assessing the man before him, not just the cop. He saw the genuine remorse, the terror, but also a flicker of courage, the courage to finally break ranks. "The district attorney is prepared to file charges against both you and Officer Sullivan," Thorne stated calmly. "Assault, unlawful imprisonment, and we have been in contact with the Department of Justice. So there is the strong possibility of federal charges for deprivation of rights under color of law. Your partner's story about a simple misunderstanding is not going to hold up against the physical evidence and a civilian witness." Kevin's face went white. Prison. The word hung unspoken in the air. "However," Thorne continued, "your cooperation, your truthful testimony, would be of significant value to the prosecution's case. It would show the court your remorse and your willingness to take accountability." He leaned back. "Detective Sanchez will discuss the details of a potential plea agreement with your attorney, should you choose to get one, which I advise you to do. But the choice is yours, Mr. Miller. You can face this with Officer Sullivan, or you can face it on your own, on the side of the truth." The message was clear. The blue wall had just offered him a door. Kevin Miller didn't hesitate. "I'll testify." His decision sent a thunderclap through the legal and law enforcement community in Harmony Creek. The police union, which had been funding Dale Sullivan's aggressive defense, immediately dropped Kevin Miller as a client, labeling him a rat. Sully was blindsided. He had been so confident, so sure that his partner would hold the line. When his lawyer told him that Miller had flipped and was cooperating fully with the prosecution, his bravado finally shattered. He was cornered. The witness, the photos, and now a corroborating testimony from his own partner. His case was unwinnable. His lawyer laid it out for him in stark terms. Go to trial, and a jury would crucify him. He'd be facing years in state prison, followed by a likely federal sentence. The alternative was a plea deal. Plead guilty to felony assault and malfeasance in office, resign from law enforcement forever, and accept a reduced but still significant prison sentence. Sully, the man who had seemed so untouchable, was broken. In a rage, he threw a lamp across his lawyer's office, screaming about betrayal, about how Miller was a weak-willed coward. But when the anger subsided, all that was left was the cold, hard reality of his situation. His life as he knew it was over. For Sergeant Frank Rizzo, the news of Miller's confession was the final nail in his coffin. The investigation had uncovered a pattern of him ignoring or bearing at least 5 prior informal complaints against Sullivan for overly aggressive behavior. Miller's testimony painted him as a supervisor who fostered a toxic environment through his deliberate inaction. Faced with being fired dishonorably, which would have jeopardized his pension entirely, and the possibility of being charged with obstruction and dereliction of duty, he accepted a deal. He would resign immediately, forfeit 1/3 of his pension, and issue a public statement of apology for his failures in leadership. It was a humiliating end to a 30-year career. The crumbling of the blue wall wasn't a single event, but a cascade. With Miller's testimony secured, Detective Sanchez and Chief Thorne began re-interviewing other officers. A few, emboldened by the clear message that the old guard was finished, began to talk. They spoke of the unwritten rules, the favoritism shown to officers like Sully, the subtle but pervasive culture of racism that had been an open secret for years. The investigation that had started with one man tied to a pole was now a full-blown excavation of a diseased department. Chief Thorne wasn't just cleaning house. He was tearing it down to the studs. The confession of Kevin Miller wasn't just a legal victory. It was the crack in the dam that allowed the truth to finally flood the town of Harmony Creek. The day Dale Sullivan walked into the Harmony Creek County Courthouse to formally enter his plea was a gray, drizzling Tuesday. The weather seemed to match the mood of the town, somber and divided. A small, pathetic cluster of his remaining supporters stood on one side of the courthouse steps, their "Support Our Cops" signs looking limp and faded in the rain. On the other side stood a much larger group of community activists, residents, and the ever-present media, their presence a silent testament to the gravity of the day. Sullivan didn't look like the swaggering, arrogant cop from that night on Sycamore Lane. He looked like a man hollowed out from the inside. His suit hung loosely on a frame that had lost 20 pounds from stress. His face was pale and drawn, his eyes darting nervously, avoiding the cameras and the gazes of his former neighbors. His wife was not with him. She had taken the children and moved in with her sister in another state the week before. The public shame and her husband's refusal to show genuine remorse finally breaking their marriage apart. Inside the courtroom, the proceedings were swift and brutal. The judge, a stern woman named Eleanor Vance, listened as the prosecutor laid out the facts of the case. Facts that Dale Sullivan now had to affirm were true. He stood before the court and admitted, in a choked, barely audible voice, to assault, to unlawful imprisonment, and to official misconduct. But it was Judge Vance's words before sentencing that truly sealed his fate. "Mr. Sullivan," she said, her voice ringing with cold fury as she peered down at him from the bench, "you did not just assault one man. You assaulted the very trust this community places in law enforcement. You wore a uniform meant to signify honor and protection, and you used it as a costume to enact a cowardly and racist fantasy of power. You did not uphold the law. You became a thug with a badge. The damage you have done will take this community and this police department years to repair." The sentence was harsh, harsher than his lawyer had hoped for. 3 years in state prison. No parole for at least 18 months. He would also be permanently blacklisted from ever working in any law enforcement or security capacity in the state of Oregon again. As the bailiffs led him away in handcuffs, Dale Sullivan finally broke. A dry, racking sob escaped his lips. The last image he saw before the doors closed behind him was the face of Marcus Thorne, watching from the back of the courtroom, his expression not of triumph, but of profound, weary sadness. The karma had been delivered, not with a lightning bolt, but with the slow, grinding, and inescapable gears of the very justice system he had sworn to uphold. Kevin Miller's sentencing happened the following week. It was a much quieter affair. He had pleaded guilty to a single misdemeanor charge of official misconduct. Because of his full cooperation and his testimony, the assault and imprisonment charges were dropped. He was sentenced to 2 years of probation, 500 hours of community service, and, like Sullivan, was permanently barred from a career in law enforcement. He lost his job, his dream career, but he kept his freedom. His wife Jessica was by his side, her hand resting on his arm. As they left the courthouse, he made a brief statement to the reporters. "I failed," he said, his voice shaking but clear. "I failed my oath, I failed the community, and I failed to be a good man that night. There's no excuse for what I did. All I can do now is serve my probation, do my community service, and spend the rest of my life trying to earn back the respect of my family and my community. I am truly sorry." He didn't make excuses. He took responsibility. It was the first step on a long road to redemption. Sergeant Frank Rizzo's karma was quieter, but in its own way, just as devastating. He was a man whose entire identity was tied to his 30 years on the force. Now that identity was gone, replaced by the stain of disgrace. His public apology, published in the Chronicle, was seen as a pathetic, self-serving attempt to save his pension. Old friends from the department stopped calling. Neighbors would cross the street to avoid him. He was forced to sell his house and move to a small condo in a town where no one knew his name. He was haunted not by what he had done, but by all the things he hadn't done, the countless times he had looked the other way, allowing the poison to spread until it consumed him too. He was left with nothing but time, money he felt he didn't deserve, and the ghost of a tarnished legacy. The cascade continued through the department. The full investigation, led by Chief Thorne, resulted in 2 other officers being fired for a history of racist behavior that had been documented by Miller and others. 3 more were forced into retraining for bias and procedural justice. The old, complacent way of doing things in Harmony Creek was dead and buried. Marcus Thorne had promised a reckoning, and he had delivered it. The individuals responsible had been held accountable. But as he stood in his office overlooking the town square, he knew this was not the end. It was the beginning. The karma had cascaded, washing away the worst offenders. Now came the hard part, rebuilding from the rubble. 6 months later, a new dawn was breaking over Harmony Creek. Chief Marcus Thorne addressed a graduating class of 8 new recruits, the most diverse in the department's history. "Your badge is not a shield to hide behind," Thorne stated, his voice echoing with authority. "It is a promise to stand against injustice, especially when you find it in your own ranks. Integrity is your only true weapon." His words were backed by action. Sweeping reforms had transformed the department. Mandatory body cameras, a new civilian oversight board, and monthly town halls were slowly rebuilding the shattered bridge between the police and the public. The culture of impunity was gone, replaced by one of strict accountability. Driving home that evening, Thorne saw Arthur Pembroke walking his dog. He stopped to thank the man who had shown him kindness in his darkest hour. "It feels different now," Arthur said, looking at the quiet street. "More honest." Thorne agreed. The work was far from over, but a foundation of trust was being laid. As he drove past the utility pole on Sycamore Lane, it no longer seemed menacing. It was a scar, a permanent reminder of a painful past, but also proof that healing was possible. The long night was over, and the difficult, hopeful work had truly begun. This story is a stark reminder that true justice isn't just about punishing the guilty. It's about dismantling the systems that allow guilt to fester in the shadows. It's about accountability, not just for the perpetrators, but for the silent accomplices and the complacent bystanders. The journey of Marcus Thorne, from a victim in the dark to a leader in the light, shows us the immense power of integrity and the courage it takes to confront a broken culture from within. The hard karma that found Officers Sullivan and Rizzo wasn't supernatural. It was the natural consequence of their own actions, brought to light by a man they tragically underestimated. If this story of corruption, courage, and consequence resonated with you, please help it reach others. Hit that like button, share this video with your friends and family, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful, real-life dramas. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you never miss a story. Thank you for listening.